I pay homage to the Buddha. I pay homage to the Dhamma. I pay homage to the Sangha. On Friday, I paid a visit to Vroman's over in Pasadena. I don't know if you're familiar with that bookstore. I've been going there for a really long time. It's one of the few bookstores left, it feels like, an actual brick and mortar shop. And I was walking around there, kind of killing time, actually. My wife and I share a car, and she had some business in Pasadena that she had to attend to, and so I dropped her off and used it as an excuse to have lunch at Earth Cafe, and then walked over to Vroman's. And I eventually found myself into the little coffee shop they have out front, bought myself a hot drink, and sat down. Outside, they have a little seating area, not many tables, not many chairs, but there was a quiet spot. There was a gentleman sitting there quietly, and I sat down next to him. And I was just contemplating my warm drink when this older woman and her adult daughter were walking down the sidewalk, and they saw all of us sitting at the coffee shop in front of Vroman's, and she said, "Look at that, sweetheart. They're all drinking their peppermint mochas," and just kept on walking with a big smile on her face. And after she passed by, I said out loud, not necessarily to the man next to me, but just sort of out loud, and if he happened to participate, fine. And I said, "The hell I am. I'm drinking chamomile." And at the moment I said that, he stiffened, was quiet, and sat there for a few minutes, and then got up and walked away. And then I thought to myself, man, I must have broken some silent agreement we had to not talk to each other at all. He was quietly sitting there, and I came in, and I quietly sat there, and we had some thing going on, and I ruined it. But then I thought about it further, and I thought, the thing is, maybe he hadn't heard that woman, which is even weirder, because that means it was completely silent, and then out of nowhere I said, "The hell I am, I'm drinking chamomile." And he's just like, "Who is this guy? What's wrong with him?" And he got up and walked away. I don't really know why. But it was one of those weird situations where you don't really know in that situation who's listening and who's not. I don't know what he heard, right? And no one knew what I heard, I guess, either. And indirectly, it reminds me of a story I read recently. In fact, that very same day in the morning. Ever since I was little, I've loved to be immersed in story. I loved reading as a child, and it's something I've tried carrying over into my adulthood with greater and lesser success. I'll admit that these days I tend to read more nonfiction than I read fiction. So when I happen to find something that's fiction and also in my interests, I get really excited. And on my bookcase for a long time, I've had a little anthology of Buddhist fiction. And I thought, ooh, this will be a fun read. Many years ago, and then I got busy with a lot of scholastic stuff, and I didn't get a chance to read it. But now, as the semester is winding down, I found myself with some free time, and so sure enough, I got to pick up that book and read some of the stories. They're all short stories in this anthology. And each one, in some way, has some Buddhism in it, supposedly. I don't know. I haven't finished the book yet. But that morning, I did read a story in there that was very interesting about an old man from Vietnam who finds his way to eventually living in New Orleans in the United States. And when the story takes place, he's of very advanced years. He's almost 100. He's now in poor health. His daughter and his other children are taking care of him now, and even his eldest daughter is already in her 60s or 70s or so, because that's how long he's been alive, that even his children are older now, and he's got grandkids and everything. And he's participating now in this tradition that he's older and he's approaching death, everyone assumes, of people coming by to pay their respects and have their last words with him while he's still well enough to have a conversation before things get too bad. And so he's in his comfy room where he has his comfy bed, and he has this big comfy chair, what he calls an oversized chair, and he sits in it. And he sits in his oversized chair as people come, and he greets them all, and they have conversations. And in the story, he talks about those that he likes and those that he dislikes. He likes all the friendly people who are there for good, honest reasons. And then he says that he really dislikes those who he feels are dishonest or of like low character and everything. And he says in the story that sometimes when these people come, and especially the ones that he doesn't like all that well, he sits in his chair and just pretends to doze off because he's an old man. Who's going to think otherwise? You have an old man close his eyes, you just assume he's napping. Or you assume he's dead, but in this case, napping. And so he sits in his chair one day as his son-in-law and his grandson are visiting. And he doesn't really care for the conversation and certainly doesn't care for his son-in-law. So he sits there and he starts sitting, he just closes his eyes gently. And at first he just has his eyes halfway open, half closed, and then eventually just fully closed. And as he's sitting there, his son-in-law and his grandson start to feel free to say the stuff they might not otherwise say if Grandpa was awake. And then they reveal something quite troubling. They reveal that a certain weapon has been disposed of. And this gets the attention of Grandpa, who's pretending to be asleep, because he starts thinking, well, what are they talking about? And he remembers that earlier that day he had read about a friend of his who had been gunned down while driving in his truck. He had a friend who was especially active in the community of Vietnamese diaspora in the area and was involved in local politics and everything. And this guy had become a true American New Orleans citizen through and through. He was driving his Ford pickup truck and everything, doing the good American stuff. And he had shared some thoughts he had on Vietnam and the government there. And sure enough, someone who thought differently decided to shoot him dead. And he was sad to hear of this, but then as he's sitting there with his eyes closed, son-in-law and grandson are like, yeah, they didn't find the weapon, the weapon, yeah, it's gone, and like clearly indicating that somehow they're involved in this conspiracy. And Grandpa eventually puts two and two together that his grandson very likely killed this man. And, the story, even though that's part of it, is not mostly about that. In fact, there's all sorts of other stuff that happens. But, after reading that story, I felt a lot like that old man, let's say, sitting there with eyes half closed and seeing and hearing people talk about things that they probably shouldn't say. And, of course, I'm referring to some stuff that I've seen online recently where let's say similar events have happened. Someone was gunned down, and I've been quite surprised at the sort of glee and delight I've seen towards it online. And, it's bad enough when it's strangers who have those views. Another thing entirely when it's, friends and family who seem to be taking delight in someone's passing, someone's death. And so, I know that this is a very tough topic. I'm not even quite sure how to approach it. I just feel that it needs to be approached. How seriously we take nonviolence in Buddhism. And so I'm by no means the old man sitting in his chair, because I'm not 100, not even by a long shot. But I am the kind of person that sits around and listens. And what I listen to, what I seem to be hearing a lot, are so many people today in our society who are clearly very aggrieved. They're very mad, they're very angry, they're very hurt. And they've allowed that anger and hurt to spill over into ill will. And I think the troubling thing is the kind of jokey nature that takes, where people are feeling as if that this thing that has happened is a good thing and it's a unifying thing, that somehow people of different views are going to be unified over the death of someone, the violent death of someone. When things like this happen in the world, I like to reflect on my own conduct. That's really all I can do. I'm in no position to fix the world. No one can. But when these kind of things happen, I think about myself and I think about the kind of qualities I'm trying to cultivate. And so, when we start these sessions every Sunday, these days we tend to start with developing goodwill. We develop loving kindness. And it's something that we develop inside for ourselves. And in doing so, I like to think, so that we can spread that around. One of the things that I said last week, as I was in discussion with Silas, was the idea that we develop this peace in us so that we have peace to give. And it's the same thing with goodwill, that we develop goodwill in ourselves, for ourselves, so that we also have goodwill to give others. Which isn't to say that we live a life of loving every single person we meet, every single person we know, and all the people out there we don't know. It's not about love. That's actually why I try not to use loving kindness. I use it because people know the word. I like to use goodwill, because you don't even have to like the people you have goodwill for. You just have to not wish them any harm. You have to wish them well-being, and that's it. Recently, or I should say now, it's been a few months, I got an email from someone who made the choice to stop practicing with myself and my teacher. And she gave a couple of reasons, but one of the reasons that she gave was that she said that she, her whole life, had struggled with arachnophobia. She hated spiders, hated them, feared and reviled them, to such a degree that she felt that she could never at any point in this life get away from killing a spider or encouraging someone else to kill a spider. And that was big enough that she's like, well, can't be a Buddhist now. Spiders got to die, right? And I think about how small and insignificant and quiet, humble really, the little spider is. Most spiders I've met, even the supposedly deadly ones, oftentimes are just minding their own business. They're in the corner of the room, maybe up in the ceiling, maybe under some dusty cupboards or something. They're just kind of there doing their own thing, oftentimes helping out. Little critters in the house, they just kind of munch on them. No big deal, right? And I can't even imagine hating a spider and really, really wanting that spider, good and dead. But oftentimes, for most of us in day-to-day life, it isn't so much that we hate the spider. It's that we just think it's nasty, it's gross, or that it's dangerous. A lot of us, especially here in the West, were encouraged growing up to kill spiders. I know I was. My dad would make a game out of all the spiders and the moths we could kill in the house. My dad was gross. He wouldn't even get a paper towel. He'd kind of mush that with his bare hand and go, look, see? I'm like, okay, cool, thanks, Dad. Gross. Wash your hands. But he'd like to be like Mr. Miyagi with the chopsticks trying to catch the fly, but with moths in his hands. Like, I got another one. Like, that's something that we have. We make little games out of this stuff. And so as Buddhists, when we start cultivating goodwill, non-ill will, and we take seriously the precept against killing, taking life, even small lives, then we find ourselves sometimes inconvenienced. You might find yourself like me, pulling over in a 7-Eleven parking lot because you realize there's a spider in your car, and then you grab it by a thread of its spider silk to run out and put it outside, and it starts crawling up the silk as you're going. You're like, ah! And trying to find a bush to put the little spider in. You might do things like that. My wife and I, in our own home, have a different game. Every time we find a little bug or a spider, we delicately, gently escort it outside. We'll find a little piece of paper or a little cup or whatever. If it's not too dangerous, we'll even let it crawl on our hand and take it outside somewhere in the garden and let it off, right? I think a much more rewarding game that we get to play, trying to help keep these things alive, but notice, not necessarily nearby, right? There's this tendency to think that when we're developing goodwill, loving kindness, that it means proximity, right? You can have loving kindness for the polar bear. It doesn't mean you got to go hug it. You can perfectly say, I have goodwill for the polar bear from right over here, right? You don't need to be close by to the things you have goodwill for, because you don't have to like them, you don't have to be close to them, you don't have to love them. You just have to not wish them any harm. And so it was quite disheartening to see this person decide for themselves that this arachnophobia meant the death of spiders. The thing is, there are many things in life that could potentially scare us, anger us, repulse us, but it doesn't have to turn into ill will. We can just have those feelings and find other ways of doing something about those feelings. I don't particularly like spiders. I just don't hate them, but I also don't wish them any ill will. I just don't want them to be near me. My wife actually kind of likes spiders. She's the type that she'd probably be cool having a tarantula in the house as a pet. I could never. Every time I've been near one of those creepy little guys, I've never wanted to hold one. They're like, here, you want to hold the tarantula? No, thank you, right? You be fine over there, tarantula. All the goodwill for you. Over there. Bye-bye, tarantula. Maybe next time. Maybe next life. I don't know. But you have to think about it this way. The humble spider, if you can have ill will for that, man, how could you possibly develop strong goodwill for a human if you're already after the poor, humble spider, right? No spider out there is a billionaire CEO, you know? So one of the things that we can reflect on is the role that anger plays in our lives. You'll notice that when I do our loving kindness meditation, our goodwill meditation, our metta meditation, I talk about greed, and I talk about aversion, and I talk about delusion. One time someone asked me why I used the word aversion for a word that means, to some people, anger, right? That's one of the translations we have for this term. And I said, well, you know, the problem with listing anger is that anger in itself is not a problem. Anger, the way it manifests for a lot of us, if you really think about the things that make you angry, they often come down many times to a sense of injustice, a sense of unfairness, a sense of something going wrong that you wanted to go right. And that in itself is not the problem. It's when anger becomes ill will that's the problem. Anger turned into ill will now means, well, I feel this way and now it's going to be your problem, come what may. And that's the part that we need to worry about. So aversion, in many ways, is ill will. We can think of them as very synonymous, certainly overlapping, which is something that we're looking to work against, train ourselves against, by training the opposite. We see ill will in our hearts, we develop goodwill as a way of counteracting it. And it can be really helpful to start with the small things. I know it seems silly to talk about the spider, the ant, the cricket, and so on. But in really, really trying to keep these things alive and allowing yourself to be inconvenienced in that way, in the way I certainly have at times, it helps us realize how rewarding it can be to live a life that way, to truly have no ill will for anyone in the world. Which is not to say that we are all of a sudden cool with all the things that people do. When we do our loving kindness meditation, we even send loving kindness to those, as I say, we don't necessarily like, we don't necessarily get along with. We don't necessarily respect or admire these people. These are people that may very well have something against us. They might call us enemy. And even in those moments, the Buddha tells us, develop goodwill towards them. One of the most, I think, powerful examples of this is the Buddha encouraging loving kindness, goodwill, even in those moments where, say, people are grabbing you, throwing you to the ground, and they bring out a saw, and they start trying to saw off your limbs. Even then, have no ill will or animosity in your heart. So when I look out into the world, and oftentimes it's through the internet these days, because it's, the double-edged blade that is, people say oftentimes the inside thoughts because they have the anonymity of being online. Many of the people sharing these thoughts could be the kind of person that if you saw them on the street, you would have never guessed it came from them. But the very fact that they revealed that about themselves can be, I think, important. It can be important to take those examples and use them to investigate your own mind. How seriously do you take the Buddha's encouragement to develop goodwill? Have you developed it to the point that it is universal? Have you developed it to the point that it is expansive? When we develop goodwill and we send it out in all directions, outward into infinity, is this something that you truly feel you can claim to have in your heart and in your mind? And if the answer is no, that's fine. That just means you're human. But it means that you have work to do. I have work to do, and you have work to do in that regard. To continue expanding our heart limitlessly, and to protect it, to protect the goodwill that we're cultivating. The Buddha's example is actually quite timely for this time of year. We're coming up on Christmas, and one of the images we have is the Virgin Mary holding her child, Jesus, right? And it's the image of the mother and child. In Buddhism, we also have that imagery in regard to goodwill, that we protect our goodwill as we would protect our only son. So, one of the ways that we can protect our goodwill is by nurturing it, by feeding it. And we can start small. We can start with ourselves, and we can start with the little lives around us. There's always little lives. Even right now, little critters. You might not see it because it's winter time. But sometimes if you sit here in the summer, little creepy crawlies like to come in through these tatami mats, right? And it can take a lot of patience to let them kind of crawl over you while you're meditating. There's a lot of really good stories like that, by the way, in various Buddhist traditions. One of my favorite stories is the Thai forest monk Ajahn Lee Dhammadaro, who would make a game out of this. He'd find some place to meditate, and it'd be covered in like red fire ants and everything, and he'd just put his little mat down and go, okay, I'm going to meditate here, and all right, ants, I'm going to extend my goodwill to you, and you're going to leave me alone, and I'm going to leave you alone. And he'd sit down with other meditators, and they'd get all eaten up, and he wouldn't. And he'd go, ha-ha, success, see the power of goodwill? And I love those kind of stories, because it's how cheeky Ajahn Lee to be throwing his goodwill around like that. It's like, see what you can do with goodwill? It's like a superpower. And it sounds outlandish. It kind of sounds like it's a made-up story, but I've actually seen people who've cultivated this, who may not even necessarily be Buddhist. I had a friend many, many years ago who was kind of a lapsed Christian, and he was very, very fearful of bees in particular. He had a phobia of bees, in the same way that this woman has her arachnophobia. I don't know what the corresponding cool Greek name for that is, but he had a phobia of bees. And what he decided to do is make a pact with the bees. He said, bees, for the rest of my life, I will never, ever, ever harm a bee. So please leave me the hell alone. And I'll extend it further. No insect, no bug, no spider, no creepy crawly. I won't kill a single one. And in return, please, 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 never sting me. And in the entire time since he had made that, up until the time I saw him last, that had stuck. He had not gotten stung at any point since he made that promise, that pact. And oftentimes that's what goodwill can look like. It doesn't mean that you're friendly. It doesn't mean that you're best friends. You just harbor no ill will. The Quite the opposite. Goodwill for their welfare, for the welfare of all beings. And these are promises that we can make and promises that we can maintain. And if we can do it for the bees, and we can do it for the spiders, and we can do it for the creepy crawlies, even if it's inconvenient, we can extend it to people, we can extend it to beings of all types, outward towards infinity. So that would be my encouragement. You know, we live in the West where we're kind of bombarded right now with Christmas. Freaking Mariah Carey, huh? You know? But this is a time when people often say, joy to the world, peace on earth, goodwill towards all men. Okay, well, we're Buddhists cultivating the path, right? We can actually do something about that because the Buddha gave us a way to do exactly that. To cultivate peace, to cultivate goodwill towards all, right? And it's not about being okay with terrible people. It's about not wishing ill will on terrible people, because that's not how terrible people become unterrible. That just creates more terrible people. So that would be my message as we go into this Christmas season as Buddhists in the West. Let's go forward and cultivate peace and well-being, goodwill in our hearts, and spread it around in whatever little ways we can. Thank you.